bioengineering and its perspective and how its approach is slightly different for modeling purposes as opposed to a physics approach. And we'll talk about ABM in a minute, but just walk us through that first from an educational standpoint.
Yeah, the answer to the first question of why I showed up at Georgia Tech was very simple. I think the way it worked was I looked at usnews.com, it ranked the top 10, I applied to the top 5, and Georgia Tech gave me a scholarship. So that was as simple as that, right? So, but coming into Georgia Tech, it was a very different perspective, bioengineering, the way it was done here, just because it was ages ahead of what I had done, what I had learned back in India as well. And so that's a good segue into your question about physics versus biology. I think there's a fundamental difference. I mean, of course, physics is different than biology, but how to think about it, right? There's one is more theoretical equation based that you're trying to figure out and how the world works. Biology is fundamentally the small things and how they interact to create something big, right? And one of them is not necessarily right or wrong. I think there have been benefits of both, but I think what this program taught me was the intersection of these two places where the magic happened. And hence it wasn't so much, I know we'll get into ABM, it wasn't so much to understand agent-based modeling, but it was just to understand the foundational truth for anything, whether it's how we do what we do or whatever that may be. You have to go at it both ways. And just going top down, which is where most of my early education was, just gives you half the picture.
Yeah, so I'll kind of bridge that with kind of my background a little bit. So I even to this day, and many of you who love technology and science fiction, there was 3 book series that made a big difference, and I still can say it applies to kind of how we build companies and apply these technologies. One is Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov is really interesting because for a person who's written so many prolific novels, the Foundation series, the Robot series, he's actually written so many college level and graduate level books, books that they use in the classroom. So I think what was interesting about Isaac Asimov as opposed to some of the other authors is I think he was the international vice president of Mensa. The guy is a genius. But at the same time, I think the genius that he was able to share in the Foundation series is the same that Carl Sagan and Feynman would say, which is that if you can't explain it in a simple way to a kid, you really don't know what you're talking about. Because there's a lot of scientists that I work with constantly that make things complicated and can't explain it simply in a way that anybody else can understand. So there is a duality to it, which is that, if you've watched, me growing up, I watched Cosmos by Carl Sagan and trying to understand the fundamental building blocks from their perspective at that time. And with the realization, there's a great book by Bill Bryson called A Short History of Nearly Everything, which at the end of the day, anything that fast forward 10 years, it's probably going to either be proven wrong or the framework in which to look at it changes. I'm not saying that the rules of physics or the rules of statistics are wrong, but things like a bottom-up approach by, especially from a computational standpoint, being able to understand how an organism works, but getting semi-real-time data allows you to build a model in the interaction level. So some of the ideas may have been around for decades, but they haven't been really practical until recently, and we're going to go into that. So from the Foundation series, what I always looked at was understanding that human behavior at the micro level can create an emergence understanding at the macro level. So ultra large population over long periods of time, how these interactions can happen to create possibilities. Now, the problem with the fundamental thesis, they created this idea called psychohistory, which I think really mimicked agent-based modeling. So if you ever get the chance, go ahead and read in the Foundation series. You'll get a framework of understanding how the behavior of an individual at large scale and its interaction with the individuals interacting with each other create certain types of outcomes. Now, on one side, somebody can say, oh, this is predicting the future. Like I know the future. But more practically, what it can do is help you avoid problems and avoid where the system starts to break down. It can't necessarily tell you what the future is going to be, but what these interactions can do is give you a framework of understanding information. And I always push back on people who say whether, especially with the statistical models, like I always say with statistical models, it's always correct till it's not, and then it catastrophically blows up, which is usually what ends up happening. Which is why, people like Nassim Taleb become very famous for these ideas like the black swan, where there's no probability of these events happening. But then if you look at some of the models, they have these fat tails, where from a distribution model, that if you go out so many standard deviations out, events actually start to happen at a higher frequency, which is really odd from the way we normally perceive. But the biggest problem is we're looking at it top down.